Hello, everybody, and thank you for tuning in to the Liberty Report. With me today is Daniel McAdams, our co-host. Daniel, good to see you.
Happy Monday, Dr. Paul. How are you?
I am doing fine and dandy, recovering, as a lot of other people are recovering. But and we saw some news today that said that maybe a lot more people are recovering because, we've read it that the herd immunity is coming in just around the corner. But all of a sudden, the weekend gave us some, I guess, they would indicate bad news or it's propaganda or what. We'll have to try to figure it out. Because the big news, if you look at any of the ordinary news views, like the television, a lot of television, the big thing is 500,000 people, deaths from COVID. And that sounds pretty bad, But then when you look into it, it raises as many questions as it answers because, for instance, there was one report by the CDC that there was only 6% had no other morbidities and just died from the virus. But when you explain to that, there's a sort of an explanation on that. So it's hard to sort out to how to say who died from this and that. And Daniel, I think that comes from that problem we've talked about for months, and that is the reliability of the test.
Yeah.
The test, the tests that they do, they know that if they don't do them right, you get a lot of false positives. It's something that the Florida governor has tried to correct, because there are too many false positives. At the beginning, they were reporting too many people that were sick, and a positive test meant their reimbursements were up. But most people say, well, that's impossible. They're too ethical to do that. Well, I wouldn't bet on that because I think the reports are biased, and now they're still working this out. Now, last week we did hear the noted professor from Johns Hopkins said, we're going to be at herd immunity in April. That's just in a month from now.
Yeah.
Wow, that's rocking the boat, especially if the boat is trying to rock along, selling everybody on the vaccines, and if you don't take your vaccine, you're some type of a criminal. So it to me wouldn't be the best thing that they want to hear, but that's questioning their ethical standards, and I think sometimes they deserve questioning because all of a sudden you have governors that aren't trustworthy.
Yeah.
You have a DeSantis and a Noem doing a good job, but then you have governors in New York and California, then you wonder what kind of reports you're getting. So the big question is how reliable are these tests? Did the virus really kill 500,000 people?
Yeah.
Is it only 6%, as was as somebody would try to read into it that only 6% didn't have other morbidities, but morbidities are pretty common too.
Yeah.
So, but sorting out the truth, and we've gone over this test a lot, and the truth is that you can't rely. That's as far as I'm concerned. You can't rely on the tests. That the tests are misleading and they can be used to certain people's advantages, whether it's reimbursements or in some cases they actually hide the deaths because it might be a bad political reflection. So whatever is necessary, but the test I don't believe is the litmus test. So even the fact finders, I don't know how they can sort that all out, especially if they come up with the real facts and not even describe the dilemma that's been going on the test that they do, because it's unreliable.
Well, the mainstream media, of course, this is a big milestone. They're having huge headlines. You told me earlier about Drudge, who I don't go to anymore, with a huge blinking headline, 500,000 deaths. And it's just not to denigrate or to question those who have lost loved ones, because people sadly do die from viruses all the time. But they're not providing the context. That's the problem. They're only providing the fear. This is no conspiracy theory that the PCR test is questionable. Even Fauci himself said, if you're running anything more than 35 cycles, you're probably getting a false positive. He said that on tape. We've shown the tape on this show. So this is not a conspiracy theory that these tests are questioned. And in fact, here I dug up just a few New York Times which is the establishment. New York Times articles. Let's look at the first clip. This is from back in September, an article that they ran. I'm sure we talked about it at the time. Your coronavirus test is positive. Maybe it shouldn't be. The usual diagnostic test may be simply too sensitive and too slow. And here's the second one. Here's this from, I think, October of that year, if I'm not mistaken. No, this is from the article. Here's a quote from it. In Massachusetts, from 85 to 90% of people who have been tested positive in July with a cycle threshold of 40 would have been deemed negative if the threshold were 30 cycles. Dr. Mina said, quote, I would say that none of these people should be contact traced, not one. And that's from that article. 85 to 90% would have been negative. And let's look at that next one finally, Dr. Paul, just to show our readers and our fact checkers. This is the New York Times as well. Coronavirus antibody test. Can you trust the results? So these are also not working as advertised. So yes, there are questions about the testing. There are also, and I know you'll talk about this, questions about the classification of COVID deaths as well.
Right. You know, whenever there's a crisis, especially in the medical field and public health, for political reasons, you know, the politicians are involved, so therefore there's a much bigger rush, and everybody is setting themselves up for being, getting a plug for being good politicians.
Yeah.
And that's when mistakes are made. And I saw it in 1976, and it could be going on right now because of this testing matter, and depend on what kind of a benefit one would get from promoting a certain position. And also, the thing goes to what is said and done, and the weighing of these issues will be deciding the vaccines. You know, what's going to happen? How much has been invested emotionally and financially and politically to get everybody a shot by summertime? You know,
yeah.
And if herd immunity is met, and the people have already, you know, when they get a chance, they defy the regulations. They end up showing up to the tune of tens of thousands of people because they're not terrified. They're saying, we don't believe what you're saying, that it's this very, very dangerous thing. But you know, this test, like you mentioned, if it's run a little bit longer, the longer you run the test, the more positives you get. So if that's what they're looking for, then you're going to get the results that you want. But I was thinking about more simpler times in medicine that I think I remember when the test for strep came out. It's been a while ago, and I thought this is pretty neat, because I think at the beginning when I was starting, we had to culture it and do it, and then they came out with a quick swab, and you can tell if you have strep, and that's so important because the treatment for strep is very important, because there are some complications from it, like heart problems and kidney problems. And you know, the test is done. I've never heard anybody say, oh, that's positive, it must be negative. No, it's probably negative. I've never heard that. And then they say it's positive, and the doctor and the patient agrees, what you need is penicillin. But that isn't what's going on now. You know, right now, the longer we go, the more questions are asked. And then of course, then there's the question, what is the proper treatment? And hydroxychloroquine. A lot of good physicians back at the beginning and even now still said this is a good treatment, but it was ruled out of order. You couldn't do it until a month or so ago. Then it rolled back in order again. And that doesn't sound like good scientific evidence. That means it's in the hands of politicians, you know, that are trying to, gain points. And of course, sometimes the treatment can be bad. Right now, this is too early to tell, but there's been a few early reports out of England, you know, on complications, and they sound a little bit scary. Hundreds, and it's a serious eye problem that they can get. But the only time is going to tell, but that's the problem. They might not even know about, the downside of the vaccines. And right now, though, the statistic, it may be that almost all the statistics we've been looking at, you really can't depend on them totally and completely. You know, because of the questions that have been raised about the test and the complications that have come for other reasons.
And you talked about it on the show too a long time ago, and this is very early on when the then President Trump's team discussed about, and the CDC put out some guidelines. When do you classify COVID as COVID in absence of a positive test? And all of these things that could have applied to anyone. If you show up with a fever, if you show up with a sore throat, if you show up with all these different things, you lose it. It's all being classified as COVID. But the question is trust the science. But the science does change. Either the science does change or people like Fauci are lying, because remember early on, don't wear a mask, wear goggles, wear 2 masks, wear 12 masks. You know, it goes on. And we actually put up a piece over the weekend showing a clip from Fauci back in 2014 when Ebola, which is a pretty nasty disease, right? It's no walk in the park, was raging. And he said any kind of quarantine for this, really, it's draconian. Locking people down is draconian. It's a terrible thing to do. So that obviously has changed, unless he was either fibbing then or fibbing now. And you remember back in September when Senator Paul was talking to Fauci, and he brought up the issue of herd immunity. He said it was like he used a 4-letter word. And Fauci, flipped out, and CDC Director Redfield flipped out. This is so irresponsible. How dare you say it? And now we're talking in open, polite society using those 2 words. So has the science changed? What's going on, or is it politics?
Sometimes it's dangerous leading the way. But Fauci made a comment, another strong comment down his line on certain days, and that is that now that people are backing away and thinking that it's coming to an end, Fauci says, it looks like we're going to have to wear masks all next year.
Yeah.
I mean, they do it with a straight face. But the media is just terrible.
Eats it up.
How often? But there's a little bit more of that. I mean, if we could go and quote the New York Times on occasion that they've brought up a question, and there's a few interviewers on Fox that will challenge people on these statistics and the other stations. But the day where we'll see, CNBC and CNN and these the outlets really reporting the facts, I think it's going to be a long way. I think it's impossible, because I don't have much confidence in the combination of big business and big government. Just the nature of it invites trouble, and it to me is the extreme opposite of what I was emphasized with in school, and that is the most vital thing in good medicine is a doctor-patient relationship. No matter how scientific it is, it's doctor-patient relationship, and then using the scientists, and don't depend on the government for almost anything.
But not only will the mainstream media, with very few exceptions, not report some of these things, and we have an excerpt from a great article that Glenn Greenwald wrote over the weekend. Not only are they not going to report it, but they're working with the Democrat-controlled Congress to force the social media companies to erase, to deplatform, to disappear any posts that question vaccines, that question the conventional wisdom about a disease. And this is really the government getting in bed with the mainstream media and all too willing social media giants to really suppress speech and destroy the First Amendment.
Here's the headline of, I think, the article you might have been citing, but the headline caught my attention, just aggravated me. White House working with social media giants to silence anti-vaxxers.
Yeah.
Silence them, And the more I understand how the social media work, and I even agitated, and good libertarians should think it through. Do we have the right to regulate private companies? And just trying to sort out the First Amendment. But they are so far removed from a private company. They're in bed with the government, and these headlines do it. They show it, and it really is this combination that a lot of people complain about. The progressive Democrats should be with us, and some of them are, and that is, when you have big business and big government together, it just leads to trouble, and it's a policy of corporatism that where the corporations are in bed with the government, and it's been that way, I imagine, for a long time. It certainly existed even in a part of our early history. The railroads, I think, were in bed with the government, and so often. But I think it's traditional traditionally, probably throughout all history, you know, the businessmen and the manufacturers may have been different in nature, but I think this combination is not uncommon.
Yeah, and you know, you used the headline uses the word silence anti-vaxxers, and this is something we see over and over. And in fact, we talked about it, I think, on Thursday, where Fauci put those people in the same group as Holocaust deniers. What you do is you create a term that is reviled. You're an anti-vaxxer. You're a denier. Whereas a lot of people are not against vaccines at all, but they want to make informed decisions and they want to hear both sides because, after all, it's their health. But you know, once you liken them to Holocaust deniers, or like the communists did, they called them kulaks, they called them this, then you can simply liquidate them as a class. And that's what they're trying to do with people. And I don't think it's working. I really don't. I think it's working using these terms. But let's move on to something that is, in a way, more interesting, because this is something that we can sink our teeth into, and certainly Senator Paul probably sinking his teeth into. But this is a piece by Dr. Marty McCary of Johns Hopkins University. You can't question his scientific credentials and background. He had a fantastic article, I think, over the weekend in the Wall Street Journal. Let's put up this next clip from the Wall Street Journal. We'll have herd immunity by April. There's that four-letter word that you're not allowed to say, herd immunity. He's using it openly. And this great thing, they're using their T-cell shields against this virus. It's a kind of a cute. But let's go to a couple of quotes, Dr. Paul, because I want to throw these out to see what you think about it. Let's go to the next clip. Here's a really important, this is starting out. Amid the dire COVID warnings, one crucial fact has been largely ignored. This is something they don't talk about. Cases are down 77% over the past 6 weeks. If a medication slashed cases by 77%, we'd call it a miracle pill. And then he says, why is the number of cases plummeting much faster than the experts predicted? And just go to the next one really quickly. He's talking about the case fatality and infection fatality rate are suggesting that roughly 2/3 of the population has had the infection. Encourage people to read the article. And then the final one, Dr. Paul, before I throw it back, this is another quote. I think this is the most important quote of the article. But the consistent and rapid decline in daily cases since January 8th can be explained only by natural immunity. Behavior didn't suddenly improve over the holidays. Americans traveled more over Christmas than they had since last March. Vaccines also don't explain the steep decline in January. Vaccination rates were low and they take weeks to kick in. So how the heck is it that the cases have plummeted in the past couple of weeks?
Like you implied before, you think the truth will catch up and the people will wake up. But right now, the panic is on. People have been taught to be fearful, to go along with all this lockdown and be obedient and be submissive and all the nonsense that we do. But right now, they had to panic the people. But right now, it's a balance between panic in the people and the panic in the special interest.
Yeah.
The people whose, maybe just their ability to produce the information, their credibility is under, some of the professors are. Sometimes it's just money because some people are making money off vaccine. Sometimes it's all kinds of things. And I think that I see a bit of panic right now because the way I saw 2 days, 3 days now of all this blasting, 500,000 people died from COVID. And since it's not a positive thing, since there's another side to it, if the goal was, there's been a lot of deaths, this is serious, and you need to be taken care of, and if you have some ABC, you should be careful when the governor tells you have to go to a nursing home. This sort of thing.
Yeah.
Use it in a different way, but say that you don't know the answer, because I don't think they do. We lean in one direction, but to know everything, mainly because we've been denied the real information because the testing is not reliable, and then the politicians aren't reliable, and the money makers aren't reliable. The system of big corporations and government, that's unreliable. But in spite of it all, I think what you were hitting there, truth will win out, is starting to see signs of it. And I just love it when people show up and they just say, we've had enough. There was a city someplace where they just decided, we're all going to the restaurants tonight. And they filled this city, the restaurants are all full and nobody had a mask on and nobody died.
Well, this is an example how the propaganda actually does cost lives, most likely, because you're having, and this is what Dr. McCary pointed in his article, he's no, quote, anti-vaxxer or, quote, denier. He pointed out that the propaganda about you got to rush and get your shot is actually, because of shortages, it's causing older folks who may want to get that shot to not have access to the vaccine if they want it, because people that have already had COVID-19, they've already had a case of COVID-19, they're rushing to get a vaccine, and in many cases getting it ahead of other people who may want it because they believe this idea that you're going to get it again, where in fact, and I think the doctor put it in his article, less than 1% of people have ever had a secondary infection, and those symptoms are extremely mild when it does happen. So they really, if you've had it, you don't have any chance of getting it again, essentially, in a major way. But believing the propaganda, older folks who may want it are being denied something which may end up helping them.
Right, and the principle that they're dealing with here is rationing. There are also a lot of problems that develop by nature. In our area, we have hurricanes, and there can be an emergency. But our governor is really bad on this, in case you need another item, because all of a sudden the most evil person in an emergency like this are the gougers, people who are trying to sort this out. So if you want to distribute any type of a product or any service, what you don't want to do is ration it, because rationing may sound reasonable, but at the same time it causes the shortages, it causes black markets, it causes all these kind of things. And so that's what we're doing. It's this mixture now of the so-called private enterprise developed the vaccine, but you have 22 companies doing that. Yeah. And then you have the government rationalizing, and sometimes it's sort of central economic planning that we yell and scream about throughout the world. As soon as they do it, we call it communism and socialism and all this. Rationing just doesn't work. But the crisis, I think, has been made much worse with lockdown. We even talked this week about the lockdown, about the lockdown contributing to our energy problems too. Yeah. That denied a good approach to inspections and things like this. So it's government management, but people still, they complain, and they should. But I think that's where we come up short. We, as believers in liberty, we come up short and we don't present it and say, look, these are the problems out here. They're going to get worse, but these are the answers. And they can't be found in more government. Yeah. How many times have conservatives and libertarians said, it's being caused by too much spending and too much borrowing and too much government regulation. So how do they solve the problem? Print more money, tax more people, and they go on, and things get worse. And that's why the lockdown. You were talking about deaths. I mean, we do know about the suicide rate and other things, and things that get closed down. And then when you get a combination, see, this financial thing started before COVID started. It started because of the business cycle that the Fed has created, and we're still in the middle of that. So they do that. They have this, and then we add on to it COVID, and then we interfere there, and we compound it, and now we have the distribution of vaccines, and there's not enough faith. So our job and our challenge is, how do you convince people to at least look at an alternative? Because the immediate effect is the big government people, their immediate effect is, oh, you're hungry, here's unlimited amount of food and housing and energy. Oh yeah, you did a good job providing energy for us. Anyway, I still think that liberty has an answer to a lot of our problems.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, here's a graphic example, and you asked me to pull this up again because it does help, and this backs up what Dr. McCary was talking about. This is the latest in the U.S. Let's put up the next quote. Daily cases in the United States, 77% decline from this winter seasonal flu season. They call it COVID. Let's look at the next one. These are the 7-day averages, and look at how this has just free fall. And look at the next one is deaths in the U.S. Absolutely declining. Of course, deaths are a trailing indicator of infections, obviously. I think it's a 14-day lag in deaths, which we'll see these deaths continuing to decline as we keep moving. And let's actually go to the next one. This is from LA. This is the center of Lockdownville, the lockdown dystopia. This is a writer for the New York Times, for the LA Times. Coronavirus transmission is slowing in LA and elsewhere, in part because something we long tried to prevent. A huge number of people have already been infected with the virus and are now immune. Let's look at the next one. And this is the actual LA Times article. New optimism that COVID-19 is finally dwindling as LA gains some herd immunity. And this tweet makes a good point. They tried to prevent this all along by not letting people go out and get
not
infected.
Not even allowed to believe in it.
Yeah, you're not even allowed to believe in it. So now they're saying, oh, well, that's why it's going down so much.
Yeah.
So, well, let's do one other thing, Dr. Paul, because we can't go through without, you hinted and you gave a little bit of an appetizer, but let's look at what Fauci said over the weekend, what he told Dana Bash. When will we return to normal? The question looms as Fauci says mask wearing may continue until 2022. And here's Dana Bash on CNN. She asked Fauci, you and the presidents have suggested that we'll approach normality toward the end of the year. What does normal mean? Do you think Americans will still be wearing masks, for example, in 2022? Fauci, I think that may be the case. That's what he said. And our great friend Thomas Massie, who is a definite friend of liberty, he threw out 3 tweets this morning. He was not having any of it. Let's look at these really quick in rapid succession. Here's Thomas Massie. 2 years to flatten the curve now? I'm sorry, but one of Trump's biggest mistakes was giving this joker a platform to steer policy instead of firing him on the spot. And here's the next one. He followed up with this one right away. How far have the goalposts moved? This is Thomas Massie. The words vaccine and efficacious have been redefined. The words died with now mean the same as died from. Uninfected people who can't spread the virus are called monsters if they don't cover their faces. There's no end date. And finally, the last one from Massie today. This is really good, Dr. Paul, once you realize the personal ethical standards of policymakers like Dr. Fauci and many of those at the CDC lead them to comfortably misrepresent scientific data in order to achieve public policy goals, it's not just your prerogative to question their science, it's your duty. Pretty powerful stuff from an actual scientist as well, Thomas Massie. So, important stuff.
I would finish it up.
Yeah, I would just, my final thought, Dr. Paul and I had this as we were sitting there, which is interesting about vaccines, because people have been told, first of all, if you question the vaccine, you're a monster and you're terrible. Right. It has to be manna from heaven. But people are told if they get the vaccine, they still have to wear a mask, they still have to social distance, and anyone who in social media is under pressure to delete any vaccine skepticism. But how could you not produce more skepticism by saying, hey, this vaccine, it's great, it's the greatest thing since sliced bread. However, you still got to wear a mask, you still got to social distance, you still can't go out to a restaurant. They are the ones who are feeding vaccine skepticism with this desperate attempt to continue milking this crisis for their own power, I think.
And they can continue to do this until they can't continue to do it. And that time is coming because it's not a viable system. But a guy like Fauci can be referred to as a dictator. And the governors, when they find out that they have legislative clout, the real problem here is not observing the principle of separating legislation from the executive branch of government, whether it's a national level or wherever. And they just take favor, and even the smallest executive now, little towns, they have little dictators. Fortunately, they're not as notorious as what we find in Washington, but he's dictatorial. The world has always been made up of a certain group of people, not a majority at all, that have a dictatorial nature. And then there's a certain group that are on our side, and we're looking for more liberty. Now, but why does it seem like the dictatorial nature of people seem to get into government? Well, because they believe in the motivation of using force and power to get their way, where we're more tolerant and say, well, people should be able to take care of themselves, and then that sort of frees up the dictatorial aspects of certain people, and they end up with control. So as far as I'm concerned, it's a contest between two principles, authoritarianism and voluntarism. And authoritarianism is endorsed by the people that want to control us, and they get involved in places, they get involved in education, they get involved in medicine, they get involved in public health, anything you can think of, and they do a great deal of harm. Voluntarism is completely different. You just reject the notion of using force against other people. Wow, that's scary. How will the people be taken care of if we don't use force to feed them and take care of them, provide jobs, give them peace and prosperity? Well, they're going to wake up someday and find out that the authoritarians are the guilty parties, and it isn't young people who want voluntarism, and I met many, that are at fault, because it is the older generation that thinks they will not have to participate. I don't think guys like Fauci and Gates actually see themselves suffering how some people have suffered, and I think they're getting to be known better, the people who have suffered from lockdown and all this nonsense going on. So I don't think we should make it complicated. I think people should think about it and decide, would you like an authoritarian society and let the authoritarians run roughshod over us, or do you believe in voluntarism and you get to run your own life? I vote for that. I want to thank everybody for tuning in today to the Liberty Report. Please come back soon.